You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel, Grand Hall, and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You can find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You can find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Jon Wertheim. You may not have heard of him, but you absolutely, if you're a sports fan, you have benefited from his work. Jon is the executive editor of Sports Illustrated and a Hoosier born and bred. Thank you, Jon, for coming on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Hoosier born and bred should have come before any other characterizations, but good to be here.
Well, in our email exchanges as we schedule the podcast, and you're very gracious to come on and give us some of your time, you wrote one of your emails, you ended it with yours and Hoosierdom. So what's it like to be in New York as a Hoosier?
Yeah, it's a little different from how I grew up, but I feel like they're people that leave their hometown. Not just, this isn't unique to Indiana, obviously. I mean, the people that run and get away from their hometown, and they try to reinvent themselves, and they never look back, and they count the days until they're liberated. And there are other people that, wish they could live where they grew up, and circumstances don't allow it, but they have a lot of nostalgia and a lot of fondness. And I'm in that second category. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, especially being a parent where, my kids live in an apartment, and my kids go to, these schools that don't have a blade of grass on them, and neither of them have their licenses, and they have no interest in driving. I mean, it's very striking to me how different my childhood was from my kids, but I really have a lot of warm feelings for where I grew up.
Jon was born in Bloomington, and do you have an early memory, let's say, not only of the town, but of Indiana University?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, I think I was born in Methodist Hospital, but I lived in Bloomington and grew up. Graduated from Bloomington North and spent my first 18 years in Monroe County. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was sort of I was a little young, but I was a kid when Breaking Away came out, and I was in fourth grade when Indiana won the NCAA title, and I was in high school when they won again in '87 with Keith Smart, and Bob Knight coached the '84 Olympic team that I've written a lot about. Where Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley and all these guys came to Bloomington, and you had Larry Bird and Michael. I mean, it really was this sort of red hot center, and where they're making Hollywood movies, and they're making, Hoosiers was shot, I think, when I was a freshman in high school. You didn't really know it at the time because you didn't know better, but it was really sort of this golden age, especially with sports. And, I think it probably stands to reason that's how I ended up in sports. It didn't seem all that remarkable at the time, probably because there was nothing to compare it to, but man, a lot was going on. From say, 79 to 89 when I graduated high school, Indiana was really this sports capital. And, I think it's probably it's no surprise I ended up in sports.
The very first TV I watched when I got out of basic training in 1987 was the IU UNLV semifinal in 1987 when IU beat UNLV. Do you remember like maybe a little bit too young for the Mark Spitz era, obviously, but how big IU was, the basketball in that area, that 76, 75, 76 team all the way through Isaiah in 81, at kind of your formative years? And did you think reading about these teams, and the soccer team as well was winning national championships, man, you know what? I wouldn't mind writing about sports for a living.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's funny you mentioned that UNLV game, and I remember that. I can go play by play on that game. That was actually, to me, that was the better game than Keith Smart beating Syracuse.
Absolutely.
But, yeah, it was. Again, I don't think we realized it at the time, but you had, sort of IU basketball assembly hall was sort of the equivalent of Cameron or of college football game day. And you're right, you had IU winning NCAA, Jerry Yeagley and IU winning NCAA soccer championships, and the Pan Am Games were in Indianapolis, and there was a tennis tournament, and there was an NBA All-Star game. And I mean, again, the 84 Olympic trials were really, I have a book coming out next year about the summer of 84. And a lot of it is about these Olympic trials where just everybody came from all over. They came to Bloomington, and Jordan and Barkley and, Patrick Ewing, they were all there. And it really, looking back, it was remarkable. I mean, here's a state in the middle of the country, and it really was this sports capital. And, it took some detachment, and it took some down seasons for Indiana basketball for that really to sort of hit home. But it was really sort of this golden age of sports in the Midwest, and it was all happening within an hour radius of where I lived.
Did you ever have a chance to meet or interview Coach Knight?
Oh yeah, I mean it's a long and
I was going to say he has a great history with Sports Illustrated over the years, including Mr. Curry Kirkpatrick.
Oh man, good memory. No, I grew up with Pat Knight. I mean, Pat Knight was. Yeah,
you're in the same class or close, because he went to Bloomington North. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, we were in the same, first grade class through senior year, and we stayed in contact. I did a piece with I think it's one of the few times that Coach Knight actually broke his Sports Illustrated ban. I did one of my first pieces for Sports Illustrated was on Pat when he was coaching in the CBA, in the Continental Basketball Association in the late '90s, and I wrote a long piece a couple years ago for Indianapolis Monthly about Knight, and it was a little bit it was a little bit first person in my experience, but just, to me, it's sort of one of these great tragedies that, people don't realize. This guy had 3 NCAA titles when he was in his mid-40s. He was the coach of the U.S. Olympic team. Every summer he turned down NBA jobs. I mean, this guy was really on John Wooden trajectory. I mean, he should have been Coach K, and, he essentially sort of couldn't get out of his own way, and had surrounded himself with, people that seemed to enable some bad habits. And it was really a great tragedy in my life. I use the word guardedly, but, it was a real tragedy to sort of see. Kids know Bob Knight as the crazy guy who threw the chair and who got mad on live TV on ESPN. And they don't realize that, in 1987, he was on this John Wooden trajectory. If you'd said in 1987 that Bob Knight's never going to win an NCAA title, I think he only went to one Final Four after that. He'd end up in Texas, and he'd sort of be known as this crazy guy who didn't want anything to do with IU, who life had passed him by, and he would become this kind of meme. People wouldn't have believed you. They'd say, no, this guy's going to go down as Dean Smith and Coach K and John Wooden as one of the all-time great coaches. It was really sort of almost biblical to me how he had declined after being, people know at the time this guy could have run for governor and won in a landslide, and to see him go from that to what the story became was really quite sad in my eyes.
You mentioned the Coach K trajectory, and would it be fair to say that very few coaches or programs have had worse injury luck with top teams than IU had, both in '75 with Scott May and his broken arm, and Alan Henderson's knee injury in 93 when they were the number one ranked team in the country, and in both occasions, actually. I mean, he had two of his best teams robbed because of sort of freak injuries at the end of the season.
We say that during a week, when an IU quarterback suffers a knee injury during the best football season of IU football as well. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the Scott May predated me. I mean, I was four years old with Scott May, but you go back and you talk to people, and they say of all of Knight's team, even the undefeated team in '76, they say that 75 team was the best team they ever had. And yeah, it's some bad injury luck there. No question about it.
Let's please bring up 1984. You mentioned the Olympic trials. It's always fun to read about. I actually was lucky enough. I was, again, in the military, was sitting in the airport in Indianapolis waiting to be picked up by a friend of mine. And I'm reading A Season on the Brink for like the 38th time, right? It just read it continuously. And I look up and walking, this is how antediluvian society was back then. Looking up, 5 feet in front of me is Michael Jordan. And I looked at him and I go, I just got done reading about you. And he looked at me and he kind of like, what are you reading? I showed him the book and he smiled and he goes, I have it and haven't read it. What am I in? And I said, the Olympic trials with Jordan. And he laughed and it just kind of moved on, gave me a thumbs up or something like that. But the epic talent of that 84 team that made the team is almost matched by the number of folks who did not make the team. Charles Barkley being maybe the most prominent. What are your memories of 1984 and that summer and that Olympic team and how it entered into the American basketball pantheon before the pros got to play?
Yeah, I mean, I love what you said with your anecdote as well, because I think that's part of it. So, yeah, I mean, you had all these guys, and picture this. You have all these players. The pros aren't in the Olympics, so it's just college kids, and this predates the Dream Team in '92. But you had all these college kids. They all come to Bloomington. They don't have agents. They're not getting paid. They're all sort of, kids in baggy clothes with duffel bags. And I remember Joe Klein, who actually made the team, said, no one thought it was weird, but you'd go to the Indianapolis airport and everybody, you'd sit on the bus and there'd be Patrick Ewing and Wayman Tisdale and Karl Malone and John Stockton. They were all on the bus taking them to Bloomington. And it was 2 people to a seat. And they didn't even practice at Assembly Hall initially. They played at the IU at the Field House, which is, decidedly less glamorous. And you're right. I mean, the players that didn't make the team were, Karl Malone and John Stockton and Joe Dumars and Barkley. Barkley was obviously the big one. Barkley didn't make the team because essentially Knight thought he was A, too fat, and B, had too much attitude. And there's some
Barkley
great stories of.
And Barkley had said, forgive me, and correct me if my memory's failing me, but I've read articles where Barkley goes, I should have made the team. And I've read articles where he said, man, I just went there to audition for the pros. So he seemed kind of nonchalant about it. Is that right? Or am I wrong?
No, you're right. Barkley came out of school a year early at the last minute. And you're absolutely right. And the way Barkley tells it, he said, I just wanted to solidify my draft place. And he played really well. And he was this, 6'4", 285-pound forward, but he also would run up and down the floor and dunk. And apparently he was very, Knight would wear, Coach Knight would wear a funny pair of shoes. And Barkley, they'd all be sitting around, and Barkley would start making fun of Knight's shoes, who clearly was not accustomed to this. And then everybody would giggle, and Knight would say, the quote I always learned, there's only one goddamn general in this army, and it sure isn't you, fat boy. So it was a great culture clash. And, Knight was the coach, but at the same time, it wasn't controlling your scholarship or your salary. So it was sort of a strange situation where it was one of the few times where Knight didn't have control over a player. But I like what you said too, because, it was this incredible collection of talent. I mean, to me, that one of the great parts of the story is everybody came to where Coach Knight was. And so guys were, taking multiple planes from Spokane, Washington, if you were Stockton, or from the middle of Louisiana for Karl Malone. They all came to Bloomington. They all auditioned. And it was at a time where, everyone knew who these guys were. I mean, everyone knew Michael Jordan, everyone knew Patrick Ewing, but sports hadn't quite gotten to this place. The money hadn't been there. The media exposure hadn't been there. So everyone has a story like yours. So Michael Jordan was walking, all the players were staying at the IU Union, and somebody, some high school, Owen Valley High School, is having their prom. So Michael Jordan walks in and starts doing the moonwalk with the Owen Valley High School prom. Or, Patrick Ewing thought he was getting picked up after watching Karate Kid at the College Mall Cinema, but the ride didn't come. So he basically hitched a ride with some guy from Bloomington driving Patrick Ewing back to the dorm. So it was this sort of mix of, everyone knew these were, nobody said, who's Patrick Ewing? I mean, everyone knew who these guys were, but we hadn't reached a point in our culture where sports was so elevated that, that there weren't security guards and there weren't publicists and there weren't agents. And I remember I was in Bloomington that summer, and you'd see, Michael Jordan would show up with a tennis racket and go to the IU courts, or you'd run into these guys walking around the square in Bloomington. They were sort of bored kids, and you didn't have this membrane. It's like you in the Indianapolis airport, right? I mean, Michael Jordan probably hasn't been to an airport in 20 years. You didn't have this kind of membrane dividing celebrities and athletes from their fans. So it was this nice mix of, like, these guys were, these guys were stars. Everyone knew them, but they also were walking through the mall like you and I were. So it was really, that's obviously, we sound old, and we sound like, I realize you sound like, I sound like grandpa on the porch here, but that could never happen today, obviously. I mean, the idea that LeBron James would show up in a college town and just, eat ice cream by himself and talk about John Feinstein's book is, comical to think about.
One of my favorite stories from the '84 team, which I've heard repeated a few times, so I'm going to just assume its veracity, and that is the story of maybe they were playing golf, or maybe they were just hanging out in a room. I can't remember. Where Michael Jordan tells Steve Alford, "No way you last 4 years with Knight," and they bet like $100. and I've heard Alford tell the story and say, "Yeah, he still hasn't paid me." And what was your impression? What are your impressions of how those players reacted to Knight, who I am assuming was completely different, even though, I don't know, Patrick Ewing played for John Thompson, and John Thompson was pretty intimidating, which is maybe one of the reasons why Knight and Thompson were such good friends. But just Knight's presence and demeanor and actions and methods, how that imprinted itself on that team.
I'm cheating here because I've just, I've written a book that deals with this. So I've talked to a bunch of the guys about it, and the other coaches too. And the answer is, it totally varies. In that some players, Wayman Tisdale, for example, former Pacer great, lovely guy. No one had a bad word to say about Wayman Tisdale. He's no longer with us, and he apparently, Knight would make him cry. I mean, he literally he couldn't deal. He had a great quote where he said, after the Olympics, I'm going back to Oklahoma, and I'm going to give a hug to even the meanest person I knew there, because I know he's really not that mean. That Knight just shattered this guy, and of course, Knight, this is what a bully does. But he knew Wayman Tisdale was sensitive, so it only made it worse. So there were stories where he would stop a practice once, and he would draw an X in the middle of the court. He said, "I would just want to mark the spot. This is where I first saw Wayman Tisdale hustle." And he would really sort of abuse that guy. And I think other players just sort of rolled their eyes and said, "Boy, I'm glad I didn't spend 4 years here." And the one guy that loved it, I mean, I think Alford knew what the deal was. And the truth is, I mean, the sort of the dirty secret is, one of the perks of taking the job for Coach Knight was that he got to pick one player, which was Steve Alford. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of an unwritten agreement that Alford was going to make the team. But one player who completely took to Knight and got him and really connected with him was Michael Jordan. And Jordan has a lot of quotes, I'm glad I never played for him, or, Dean Smith taught me the 4-corner offense and Bob Knight taught me the 4-letter word. But the truth is, Jordan and Knight had a lot of connection, and they really both understood that this driven personality, and we saw in The Last Dance, Jordan could be kind of a bully, and Jordan would find a soft teammate like Scott Burrell, and he would ride him. Well, that's classic Knight. So it's funny because some players couldn't stand Knight. Some players sort of rolled their eyes and said, "Man, this guy doesn't do it like my coach." But one player who really took to him was Michael Jordan. They really spoke the same language.
Just so maniacally competitive and do anything to win. There was a sign, I think, that was in the IU locker room. Everyone has the will to win, but not everyone has the will to prepare to win. And it seems that Jordan had that more than anyone else. The other great Jordan story that I want to ask you about, that's not necessarily related to the Olympic team, but it happens right afterwards, I believe. And that's when the draft comes in '84 and Houston has the first pick. They're going to choose Hakeem Olajuwon. Everyone pretty much knew that. But Portland had the second pick, and they decided to choose Sam Bowie over Michael Jordan. I think mostly they had Clyde Drexler, so they had a kind of dynamic wing player.
Mm-hmm.
But Knight had a conversation, I forget with whom, but someone who was a good friend of his on the Trailblazers, and Knight's like, "You got to take Jordan." And the Portland guy says, "Well, we need a center." And Knight's reply was, "We'll play Jordan at center." Like, you don't have any idea how good this kid is. Did you also get the sense, we talked about Jordan and Knight, but changing the relationship a little bit, that Knight quickly realized this kid is just simply better?
The summer of '84, before Michael Jordan has played a single NBA game, Knight basically says, "This is the best basketball player I've ever seen. This guy's going to be one of the best ever. You've never seen." I mean, the quotes from that summer, and this is not someone who's given to flowery praise. To his credit, Bob Knight knew this guy was special. Yeah, I mean, he told the Blazers story I love. The other thing is sometimes, I mean, again, he and Jordan they got each other. Sometimes he would say to Jordan, like, basically, "I'm going to scream at you, just take it," because he wanted to show the rest of the team that Jordan wasn't above, wasn't above condemnation. But then Jordan would get him back later. And it really was you sort of look at the qualities we use to describe Jordan, and it's take no prisoners, and it's outwork everyone, and it's what you said, maniacally competitive. Those match up awfully well with Coach Knight. And you're right. I mean, I'll tell you another funny thing is that Knight didn't want any of the players going to New York for the NBA draft. So Michael Jordan gets drafted, and he's in Bloomington. And basically, George Raveling drives him to a local TV station. They put a piece of plastic in his ear. He says, to the Chicago media, "I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to help build something." Goes to McDonald's, and then he goes back to practice. So it was not a big draft night party for Michael Jordan in the summer of '84.
And two other things before we move on, we should note, in talking about 1984, just a few months before the Olympic trials, IU, with Alford as a freshman, ended Michael Jordan's career in the regional semifinals in the NCAA tournament, and one of the great upsets of all time. I remember watching that game live, as I'm sure you do as well. Just no way. North Carolina had 4 number 1 draft picks on that team, and the only IU player taken in the first round was Uwe Blop, and IU won. So that's A. B, when Jordan had his number retired by the Chicago Bulls, there were 2 people on the podium, 2 coaches who talked. Dean Smith was one, and Bob Knight was the other.
I didn't know that. Oh, that's a good. I mean, Knight that summer would always, I'm going to have to bring out Dan Dockich to stop you, Michael. I mean, that Knight would lord that defeat over Jordan. That was last college game Michael Jordan ever played. You're right. Was a loss to IU. I didn't realize that. That's a good pull. I didn't know that Bob Knight was at that Chicago Bulls ceremony. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of again. I don't think too many people say Dean Smith and Bob Knight are it's two very different approaches to the job, but they both really seem to connect with Jordan.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel, Grand Hall, and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney & Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today is Jon Wertheim, executive editor of Sports Illustrated, and a man who grew up in the friendly confines of probably one of the most beautiful towns and campuses in the country, and that is Bloomington and Indiana University. Jon, let me ask you another quick question before we move on, because I want to talk about how you went from Bloomington, Indiana to New Haven, Connecticut to attend Yale. But is there a particular Hoosier leader or legend you admire?
That's a good question. I mean, someone who was very instrumental to me was Bob Hamill, who was, sort of the John Wooden of sports writing, who was the columnist at the local paper, who I've had the good fortune of getting to know a bit, who was just thoroughly decent and hardworking, and really someone who opened my eyes to what you could do, putting words to sports. More broadly, Indiana fascinates me as a state, and I don't know how you would ever quantify this, but from, Wendell Willkie to Mike Pence to Mayor Pete, I would maintain John Roberts. I would submit that there is a wildly disproportionate impact that Indiana has had on this country compared to other states. Again, whether it's innovation or sports or politics, or 2 of the 9 Supreme Court justices right now.
David Lee Roth, John Cougar Mellencamp,
yeah, right.
Lawrence
Axl
Henderson,
Rose, Michael Jackson. Yeah, you could play this. And again, this is not a state that even now I tell people, well, I'm from Indiana, and they say, is that the one with Des Moines? It's still sort of I think on the coast there's still a bit of obscurity, and people know it. It's for cliched reasons. It's for the Indy 500 or maybe for Mellencamp. But I would. I will always submit that Indiana has a wildly outsized impact on this country and this culture than people might otherwise think.
Orville Redenbacher has a huge impact on the United States for his own reasons. I'm glad to know that you know Bob Hamill. We've tried to get him on the podcast, and now I know that I can drop your name for my latest email. I am definitely going to do that.
Lovely man.
You went to Yale. Why Yale? Why not IU? And how did that happen for you? Because it's obviously one of the most prestigious universities in the world.
Yeah, I don't know. You're 18 years old, and I had, again, my folks both worked at IU for many, many years, and I took some classes there over the summer, and the campus was kind of my playground, and I just, sort of time to get away. I thought it would be really weird to go to college somewhere that I knew inside and out like that. There wouldn't be any kind of surprises or mystery or mystique. So I wanted to, go beyond Indiana and get out and sort of just, again, it was a different time period. It's probably a lot easier to get into college then than it is now, and ended up, ended up going to school in Connecticut. But again, one of those people, even go, I'd love to come back in the summers. And I wasn't one of these people who, get me out of here and I never looked back. Indiana was always kind of pretty close to whatever I was doing.
Did you get a sense, though, you mentioned the movie a few minutes ago, the movie Hoosiers, that really shaped some people's perception of, especially sports fans? Hoosiers is universally regarded as one of the greatest sports movies of all time, and is mentioned by basketball players from all over the country, right? You don't have to be from Indiana, as something that they really enjoy. Do you think that had an impact, maybe reinforcing some stereotypes and busting others?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's always funny to me what people think of as Indiana and what they don't. So, for example, one thing no one ever really thinks about Notre Dame in the context of Indiana. Right. People are always surprised to, whatever. Even to some extent, David Letterman, or people have this idea of Indiana. It's always interesting to me what sticks and what doesn't. And guys shooting small town, bandbox, barn basketball and bunch of hustling kids and the picket fence. And again, spending so much time in sports, Hoosiers was going to resonate more than Axl Rose and David Lee Roth and Mellencamp and Michael Jackson. But I do think Hoosiers, for better or worse, I don't quote me on this, but I think that the same night the Academy Awards were being held, the year Hoosiers was nominated, it didn't win, but I think it was the same night Indiana beat Syracuse.
That's right.
And someone was saying that, like, I turned to one channel and there's Steve Alford and his feathered hair moving off the pick and hitting a jump shot, and there's Jimmy Chitwood, and we get it already. Indiana guys know how to shoot. But it's always interesting to me.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Let me ask you a question about that being on the East Coast. Forgive me. We haven't talked about the Pacers much, but were you in New York on the East Coast when Reggie Miller was lighting up Spike Lee? And did that give you a sense of pride?
Yeah, absolutely. No, the answer is yes and yes. And I can't remember where I was. I think I was in law school, but that had a lot of it too, right? It was kind of this, it was Spike Lee and then you had, Slick Leonard and Boom Baby. And I can't remember the headline in the New York Post was something against the Hicks. And, Indiana had, Reggie was Reggie, but then you had Rick Smith and you had, I remember for some reason, Slick Leonard figuring very prominently in that whole, it was really a trilogy. I mean, it was really 94, 95, 96. Is that right? It was 3 straight playoff series, wasn't it?
And
but the Reggie game, the 11 points and I don't remind me again. What was it, 9 points in 7 seconds or whatever?
Basically, yeah, 8 points in 9 seconds. Did it? Did you bring that when New York and the Colts were kind of down and the Pacers were kind of down, but IU was probably playing in Madison Square Garden. I think they won the Big Apple NIT preseason NIT once there, but Indiana's sports history in the sports figures we have produced, the state has produced, can stand up with anyone. And has that been something that you've enjoyed covering? I don't know if you've had a chance to talk to Larry Bird or had a chance to talk to Oscar Robertson and others of that level, but we've produced our fair share of iconic sports figures.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And, and not just, I think the Colts was sort of an interesting wrinkle in that we knew it was a basketball state. We knew about Wooden and Larry Bird and Oscar Robertson. I mean, it was always interesting to me how we knew less about Glenn Robinson and Zach Randolph and Greg Oden. I mean, it took a bit of a turn, even though Indiana for still through the 2000s was still minting an awful lot of NBA players. And when it seemed like when the Colts were down, the Pacers were up, and when the Pacers were down, the Colts were up. And football's a little different just because it's not quite as embedded in the fabric of the state. And we all love Peyton Manning, but he sort of had the Tennessee thing going. So how much could Indiana claim him as their own? But no, I mean, Indiana sports is something that again, I'll add that to the politics theme too. I mean, again, this is for a fairly small state with only one significant city. The impact of Indiana on sports, I would say, is awfully outsized.
You mentioned earlier, just a few minutes ago, about the 500. Have you had? I used to work at a hotel, the Crown Plaza Airport. And people would come in, this was 25 years ago when I was in college, and they would come on race weekend and you check them in and the hotel, of course, would be full. And I always enjoyed asking them, have you ever been to the 500 before? Like, is this, and they're like, no, we're just coming in. They're kind of like, yeah, we're just coming in for a corporate thing or a business thing and looking forward to it. And I was like, I'll be working Sunday night. I'd like to know your impressions, or, come and tell me what you think. And 100% of the people would come back, whenever, take their shower, get something to eat, and they'd come to the front desk at some point and look at me, and they would be like, I had no idea that it was going to be that absolutely amazing with that many people. Have you had friends of yours and people you've met in New York City or in the East Coast who either their only visit to Indianapolis was for the 500, or that they went to a race and came back with their eyes bulging like, oh my God, what an event?
It's funny because, Bloomington's an hour from Indianapolis, but it's only, maybe 100 minutes from Louisville too. And I always think it's very similar to what people say about the Derby. So people, why would you ever want to go for a stupid 3-minute race? Or why would you want to go and watch people make, 200 left turns? And then people go, and exactly, they're like, this is the greatest sporting. I had no idea. This is like going to the Masters. And I think people that don't, and I'm not the last of the auto racing fans, and I'm not a huge racing fan or a NASCAR fan or an IndyCar fan, but as a sporting event, it's terrific. And I've only been to the 5. I didn't, in retrospect, I wish I'd gone more often. And I don't know what the ticket situation is now, but growing up, it always seemed like someone had a ticket, or they were floating around, or there was, the Q95 giveaway. It didn't seem like that tough a ticket.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I've had the same experience. People are skeptical, then they go, and they're like, "Oh, this is unbelievable." So,
well, I think you have a connection at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway now, John, which I'm sure you could. I'm happy to help you leverage, and that's Mr. Mark Miles, who who's running that place and has for the last few years, and he and his team, Allison Millangton, Doug Bowles, everybody, they've turned that 500. It's an amazing event. It's had some great races. But I think it was a couple of 3 years ago on maybe the 100th running or the 100th anniversary that one in every 1,000 people in the country was at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Is that right?
Had more than 300,000 people there for a race.
Oh, that's wild. No, Mark, I'm a big fan of his. It's always bittersweet because Mark is terrific and a great guy, but he used to run tennis for many years, including when I started in tennis, and we miss him. And every time I hear about success of the 500, I wish selfishly, I wish he were still in the sport I cover week in, week out. But no, that's great to hear. And Mark, I'm sure everybody knows that they're lucky to have him.
Well, he's been a guest on the podcast a couple of times. He came on by himself. For those of you who know I'm talking about, it's Mark Miles, who used to run the Association of Tennis Professionals, which is the men's worldwide tennis tour. His resume is phenomenal. Probably the best leader I've ever met, non-elected official, but just the Midas touch. And he also came on with a few other folks to discuss how Indianapolis won the Super Bowl bid of a few years ago, because he was chairman of that effort. Jon Wertheim is our guest on the Leaders and Legends podcast. I confessed to him a tennis addiction, watching and tennis history. And hopefully that's one of the reasons John came on. He's the preeminent tennis writer in the world. If you're a tennis fan, you have to read his musings and his columns, especially around the bigger events, because he just does an absolutely terrific job. Why tennis? How did you get that beat? And talk a little bit about how much you enjoy it. And you certainly go to some of the best locations in the world.
Not this year, but I grew up playing tennis, and then Lynn Loring, who was the IU women's coach for many, many years, sort of one of these John Wooden, Doc Councilman type figures who was there for decades and very successful. He was really my first coach. I always loved the sport, and Indianapolis, ironically enough, run by Mark Miles, used to have an event every summer, right where the NCAA is now, right? Just a few blocks west of downtown. At IUPUI. So, you'd go up and you'd watch, Pete Sampras would play, and you'd watch the best players. And I got to Sports Illustrated, and the great Frank DeFord, who was a real sort of, after Bob Hamill, a real mentor of mine, sort of said, it's great that you want to be a generalist, and it's great you want to write about a bunch of sports and be versatile, but you really ought to pick one to just kind of sink your teeth into, and it doesn't have to come at the exclusion of anything else. You can still do your basketball and your football and write your features, but take one sport that you can really sink your teeth into. And he suggested tennis. And I said the same thing you did. I said, oh, that sounds great. You get to go to Paris and you get to go to Australia. And he said, that's part of it. But the other part of it is sort of everyone's a little bit crazy, and everyone is sort of in it for themselves. And what I came to realize was that it's not unlike what we were talking about with Michael Jordan in 1984. All the players are independent contractors. There's not really a league. They're not teams. And what that means is that everybody's pretty accessible and everybody gets to know everyone, and there are no home games. So you sort of have this traveling circus. And I think the people in the tents, the people in the community sort of have this, it's really has this kind of family atmosphere. So, if you want to, you can't abuse the privilege, but if you want to talk to Roger Federer, you get in touch with Roger Federer. It's not like that covering Tom Brady or Peyton Manning or LeBron James or Tiger Woods. So it's a really fun sport for me to write about. They're men, they're women, they're players of all ages. They're from all over the world. They're different backgrounds, but it's also nice to actually, I did a 60 Minutes piece on Rafael Nadal last year and went to Spain, and, we've known each other for 15 years, and I wouldn't say we're hangout buddies, but, we know each other and say hi and showed me around and people said, how did you get that rapport with him? And I sort of said, rapport? I've known the guy for 15 years, and, you talk to him and have meals with him and run into him at airports, and you get to know someone. And I think tennis is really one of the last sports where that still happens. I mean, I think, you hear these stories of guys that cover the Lakers for an entire season and LeBron James doesn't know their name, or you cover the Patriots for years and years and never once get an interview with Tom Brady. And tennis is small enough so that doesn't really happen. So, I started tennis in the late 90s and kind of stuck with it. And it's really, it's not necessarily the bulk of what I do, but I really enjoy it. And I really like the people.
One thing that's happened in Indianapolis is the loss of the tennis tournament, because the tournament in Cincinnati just got to be so big that it kind of just, I hate to say it, killed the Indianapolis tennis tournament. But when it was thriving in the good 70s, 80s, and 90s, as it went from clay to hard court, it won. I mean, Connors came here, Borg came here, Agassi came here, Sampras. I mean, all the top players, number one players. And in the Indianapolis tournament won favorite tournament among the men's tour. It was only a men's tournament at the end. It won favorite tournament for years in a row. Typical Indianapolis, kicking it out of the park.
That's exactly right. I always said there's a real sort of metaphor there, that these players, and they're used to Monte Carlo and Tokyo and Sydney and all these fancy cities around the world. And, they're on the Mediterranean and Paris, and they come to Indiana, and, they're not beautiful beaches, and they're not going to be 10 different 5-star restaurants, but everybody there bent over backwards to make the players feel welcome and hospitable. And they came up with go-karts, and they were, people would they'd go to, I remember they would have, there'd be like jet skiing outings, and there'd be tours of the Speedway. And it was real. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but it was real Hoosier hospitality. And at the end of the day, these players are like, you know what? Like, I could take or leave Monte Carlo. It's a beautiful view, but I only look for a few minutes. I'd much rather come to this great town in the middle of the country and have lovely people treating me well and have, genuine conversation. And you're right. These players, they came from all over the world, and they fell in love with this tournament in the middle of summer in the middle of Indiana. And this always got these top awards over, you'd look at the other, it was like Indianapolis won, and then it would be like, Stockholm, Palm Springs, Monte Carlo and Paris would be the next four. And you'd say sort of which of these doesn't belong, but Indiana was doing something right. And I would submit there's sort of a deeper lesson to be learned there.
You mentioned you started covering tennis in the late 90s. You certainly got to cover tennis and continue to cover tennis. Let's stay on the men's side for just 1 second, because Serena Williams has been so dominant for the last decade plus on the women's tour. And when she's healthy, she wins most of the time. But I want to ask you about her in just a second. But just speaking with the men's tour, in the last 20 years, you have covered on a consistent basis probably 10 of the top 20 players of all time. For a journalist to be able to be in the presence of such greatness and such achievement, what does that do for you for your writing?
It's a great question, because sometimes it's a challenge. I mean, think about, Michael Jordan wins 6 titles in 7 years and 8 years. And by the time, there are only so many ways you can talk about an amazing move. There are only so many ways as a writer you can describe Roger Federer gracefulness or Rafa Nadal's hustle. But it also is really special. I mean, it used to be, Andre Agassi, great player. It's, John McEnroe, great players. Guys like that would win 7 or 8 major titles, and they would be these legends, and they'd be no-brainer Hall of Famers. You'd win 7 major titles, and they'd be, naming rackets after you, and it's Mount Rushmore stuff. Well, now you've got 3 guys, and Roger Federer has 20, Rafa Nadal has 20, and Novak Djokovic has 17. So you're talking about 3 guys that have won almost 60 among them. It's just extraordinary, and the fact that they're all 3 good guys, like genuinely good people. You don't feel like you go back and you look at some of the Tiger Woods coverage, and people would say, everybody sort of knew there were these rough edges, but nobody wanted to rock the boat. I mean, there are not a lot of rough edges in tennis, and you're covering 3 towering champions, but the fact that they're also just genuinely good dudes really helps. It can be a bit challenging, journalistically, to just kind of come up with something new to say.
Well, because, I read your column, the most recent one, about Nadal's destruction of Djokovic in the 2020 French Open. You just sit there watching it, and you're like, is Djokovic? He's like really one of the 3 or 4 greatest players of all time, right? Like, I'm watching one of the greatest players of all time just get utterly spanked. And it's funny to read about Federer or Djokovic talking about Nadal, who's my favorite current player, on the clay in Paris. And so your point about writing about it, at a certain point, you're like, I just don't know what else. How many more ways can I say magnificent?
Exactly. I got nothing left. No, I mean, the fact that, John McEnroe won 0 titles after he turned, 0 majors after he turned 25 years old. Yeah. I mean, Pete Sampras, by his late 20s, great career, but, the things were starting to fade. Nadal at about 34-year-olds. Roger Federer is going to be 40 next year. So it's the greatness, but also the longevity.
And they're doing it against each other. I mean, they're winning all these. I mean, you had Stan Wawrinka win a few, and Del Potro. I remember he stopped Federer's run of 5 consecutive U.S. Open titles, and there's been a sprinkling here and there. But I mean, for year after year after year, it was either in Andy Murray to a certain extent, but it's Djokovic, Federer, or Nadal winning every single major, almost every single year. And I think one of the things that's so impressive about it is it's not like they're padding their stats by playing the Washington Generals, right? The equivalent of tennis.
Exactly.
I mean, Nadal has to beat Federer, and Federer has to beat Djokovic to win the title, and it's just amazing tennis.
The sort of cloud over all this is like, man, what's it going to look like in a few years from now? But for the moment, it's just extraordinary, and it's also nice that I think people are recognizing it too. That sometimes, you have this in sports. Like what I was saying about Indiana in the 80s. I mean, at some point, we didn't know how good we had it, and we wish we would have appreciated it more. I think most tennis fans recognize this is not just generational. This is really once in a lifetime stuff, and that we're going to go back to, one major. It's like golf, right? I mean, one major it's him, and the other major it's him, and everyone's got a story, and it's competitive. But you don't have 3 Tigers. And that's what tennis has right now.
You mentioned previous eras. I should mention to the Leaders and Legends podcast audience that you also cover MMA as part of your beat and have written about it before. Is it fair to say the tennis equivalent of mixed martial arts was Jimmy Connors against John McEnroe? And you talked earlier about how the current male tennis stars are such good guys and they're very praiseworthy of each other and they help each other's charities and so on and so forth. Whereas I remember Dick Enberg, who has a PhD from University, the late Dick Enberg, said that he was scared to invite Connors and McEnroe to play tennis on his home tennis court because they'd start fighting. Do you miss that? And do you kind of wish, like, I wish I would have been around to cover that level of I'm not going to say hatred because I don't know that that's the right word, but the certain level of just discontent toward each other.
I think we're all really torn about that because, if you're writing, part of what makes writing fun is the tension and drama and friction and agitation. You don't have a lot of that now. And you look back and the idea that exactly like you said, like, the Connors and McEnroe would play each other's charity events, or, the minute Rafa Nadal won the French Open that you were talking about a few weeks ago, he ties Roger Federer. This is this, decade and a half long quest to see who's going to be better. And their horse races finally tied 20 majors apiece. And one of the first people to congratulate Nadal is Federer, basically saying, what an honor it is to be competing alongside you.
Via Twitter.
It feels like, exactly.
Well, and in the ceremony, Nadal apologizes to Djokovic saying, "Hey, I'm kind of sorry, but you whipped me a couple of years ago in Australia." Exactly. And then, I don't know, about 5 or 6, 7 years ago, when Nadal wiped out Federer like 6-1, 6-2, 6-love in Paris, he's like, "Hey, Roger, I'm very sorry about the final." I mean, could you imagine Jimmy Connors saying after the 82 Wimbledon, "Hey, John, I'm very sorry about beating you in 5 sets for the Wimbledon. You're a really good player." That wasn't going to happen.
So if you're in my shoes, or if you're a fan in general, do we like that, or do we secretly say, boy, it would be a little more theater here if these guys hated each other, and if these guys, they didn't even hate each other, there were a little bit more friction in the air. I think all three of these guys are just good dudes. I think at some level they recognize it's really special. I also think that they all have made this kind of performance decision that says, I'm going to be a better athlete when I just worry about playing and I just worry about the ball, and I don't want to get in a Twitter war, and I don't want to have this bitter rivalry, and I don't want everything I say about this guy to go through the social media spanking machine. I mean, some players really, we were talking about Jordan before, or certainly McEnroe, some players really need conflict. And I think these three guys have kind of made up their minds that conflict is just going to be a distraction. And I think Federer and Nadal genuinely like each other, but I also think they both have arrived at this conclusion that it's not going to help them win to dislike the other guy. It's ironic. You actually see that in mixed martial arts as well. Some fighters really want to have beef with the other guy, and they try to get in their head at the weigh-in, or they troll them on social media before the fight. And other fighters say, like, no, I don't want that in my head on fight night. I just want to do this as a physical exercise. I don't need that other dimension. I don't want to hate my opponent. These three guys certainly, have it's hard too, because as a fan, we say the same thing about in tennis because of, with line calls. And it's great that we have accuracy. We have replay now in tennis on line calls. And so what it means is that you have a lot more accuracy. You don't have matches that are left to these judgment calls. You don't have these times where, replay showed the ball was out. But what it also has done is it's taken a lot of the arguments. You think about tennis, and you think about McEnroe, people can still quote 30, 40 years ago. People still remember some of the lines he had when he was yelling at the chairs and the pits of the world, and you can't be serious. And so people sort of, you feel a little guilty saying it, but there are people that say, man, I kind of miss the old days when, the players may get bum calls, but at least we got to see this real agitation. We got to see all this conflict. And I feel a little bit about this the same way talking about Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic, that on the one hand, it's lovely how sporting and what good sports they are, and how much, respect and camaraderie they have. But yeah, every once in a while, it would be fun if they had a little more of the Connors-McEnroe thing going.
Well, and when Connors and McEnroe and Ilie Nastase were at their prime, people were saying, "Oh, I wish it was like it was when it was Stan Smith and John Newcomb and Ken Rosewall and Rod Laver. Why can't we go back to that?" Let me ask you one more question about that, and then I want to have a very quick GOAT conversation, because that seems to almost dominate some of the questions you get in your Sports Illustrated column. We're on the Leaders and Legends podcast with Sports Illustrated executive editor Jon Wertheim. Watching a special on ESPN, Sports Century, my favorite player from that era is Jimmy Connors. And Mary Carrillo, who I would love to have on the podcast because I think she is the best analyst of any sport. Her comments are always just right on the money, and she seems like a terrific person. She said during one of the Sports Century segments on Jimmy Connors, he may not be the best player who ever lived, but she was pretty sure he was the most important tennis player who ever lived. Do you think there's a lot of accuracy in that statement for what he did for the game when he did it?
That's an interesting comment. I mean, I got to say, I'm guessing that was made before this era we're in now, and also before the Williams sisters.
Correct.
But I do think, I think one thing we overlook sometimes with McEnroe and Connors is just they took tennis to a very different place. And tennis, I think, too easily gets dismissed. Oh, it's a country club sport, and it's, a bunch of dweebs in cable sweaters. And pretty hard to align that with Connors and McEnroe. And it brought a different sensibility. I mean, you see Connors, and he's sweating, and he's clutching his fist, and he's dating a Playboy model. And that is not the country club, like lawn tennis image that you get sometimes in pop culture. So I think McEnroe and Connors both did get enough credit for taking tennis to a different audience.
And that was kind of her point. Her point was he brought it out of the country clubs and made everybody watch. That he made it much more, maybe perhaps as Arnold Palmer did for golf, kind of an everyman. He was taught by his mother, taught by his grandmother, came up in tough circumstances. And he just, tennis before, to me, because I agree with her, there's before Connors and after Connors in terms of the public perception and interest in tennis, and how much more egalitarian it got after Jimmy became a world champion.
Right. I would, Mary is a dear friend and a colleague. I'm curious when she made that comment, because I think if that was her point, I would say yes, absolutely. But I would say two African American sisters from Compton who played into their 40s and won almost 30 majors between them, probably went even further than Connors did in terms of distancing tennis from this country club image.
A great point. And in her defense, I don't remember the exact year, but I think it was like in the 90s, because his Connors run in the 91 US Open is a part of the Sports Century on ESPN. But I mean, the documentary itself's got to be 25 years old. Let's talk GOAT. And I want to kind of focus on the women's side of the tour. It's by that, I mean, greatest of all time. It comes up in tennis discussions. It seems to be more than any other sport. Who's the GOAT? Maybe NFL quarterback and NBA, but that's a different discussion because you're talking team sport. Is just using the one term, greatest of all time, is that a disservice? Because clearly you could look at it in different ways. Who's the most accomplished of all time? Which I think is Martina Navratilova. How many Grand Slam trophies does she have? 50 something?
Exactly.
It's unreal.
Over 25 years. Yeah.
Who's the most talented of all time? which I would say is, who would you choose to play for your life if you could choose anyone? Do I think Dan Marino is the greatest quarterback of all time, accomplished? Well, of course not. But if I had to choose one quarterback to make one throw to save my kid's life, I'd choose Dan Marino. And then the third is greatest, because couldn't you make an argument in a lot of ways that Billie Jean King is the greatest female tennis player of all time for what she did for the sport and for her causes? So it's just the one GOAT question. Is that too general? And is there a need to break it down based on these other kind of subcategories?
Man, that's a good question. I mean, I think I think part of what makes it a lively discussion is how ill-defined it is. I mean, I think people like the lack of a definition. So what's an important criteria for person A? So, Billie Jean King was a social pioneer. If you won a few fewer major titles, well, who cares in the grand scheme of things?
Right.
And other people would value longevity, and other people would value singles versus doubles. I mean, I think the fact that you have all these factors, and yeah, I mean, the NFL quarterback example I think is pretty good. I mean, nobody's basing this just on Super Bowls won. So for somebody, it's how much do you discount that they played with a coach that only let them throw the ball 25 times a game, and how much do you account for the defense on the other side of the ball that would have, I mean, there are all sorts of these factors that we haven't really, there's no.
Or Johnny Unitas, who became,
yeah, exactly.
who became the first superstar quarterback of the TV era. And without TV, then the NFL is clearly not the NFL, but he was the first big time champion quarterback with his flat top as TV took off in the post-World War II era. So is he the best? Is he the most accomplished? No. But could you make an argument that without Johnny Unitas' skill and prowess, that things would have been different for the NFL on television?
Exactly. How much, I'll give you one in tennis, which is how much do we account for money? And, Roger Federer has a whole team, and if his back's feeling a little, his back's feeling a little tweaky, he gets a back specialist, and he's not going to the Indianapolis airport. He's not flying commercially, and he's got a whole staff. Well, Martina Navratilova tells me stories about, she'd get delayed at O'Hare on her way to some of her biggest titles. How much do we account for that? So, I mean, part of the fun of this is that there's no set criteria, and some of this is, we're never going to get a satisfactory answer ever comparing eras, right? I mean, just Jordan versus LeBron and, Bird versus, sort of how much do we pad the eras? And on the one hand, they didn't necessarily jump as high or run as fast, but they also didn't have the equipment. I think it's almost sort of, it's more about the judger than the judgee. It's almost about as much about you and what you value and what your sort of priorities are and what you want to stress than it is about the player. But no, tennis fans are absolutely obsessed with this discussion on the men's and the women's side, and we're never, of course, going to resolve this thing. But I think that what makes it fun but also frustrating is that we haven't even decided on the ground rules yet. I mean, we haven't even decided what the rules of engagement are. And exactly what you said.
So if Jon Wertheim, tennis writer extraordinaire, has to choose one female player to be his champion in one match, who would you choose? If you had the first overall draft pick in the history of female tennis to create a super team, who would you choose?
So if I were being lame and argumentative, I'd say, what's the surface? What are we playing? What's under my feet? Hardcore. No, I don't know. I think, to me, Serena Williams is pretty much check more boxes than anyone.
You don't know how often I've started to type that question to you for your mailbag on sportsillustrated.si.com and haven't done it. So the fact that I can actually ask it to you is a huge and I agree with you. I think Serena at her best, is the most talented female player of all time. As I would say Federer, when Federer was rocking and rolling 10 or so years ago, I think he's the best. He would be my first round draft pick if I had to choose on the men's side. If you had to choose on the mid side, would you hit Roger as well?
Yeah, I think you said hard course, which makes it easy. No, I mean, the bed's getting a little tight, and we'll see what happens. And Djokovic has a winning head-to-head record against Federer and Nadal, and he's the youngest of the three. But no, I think right now, as of today, I'd say Serena and Federer. And I think you're right. I think some of it is just what you said before about one point to play with my life on the line. That's probably the guy I'd want. And Serena, I just think, is unbelievable. I mean, Serena won the U.S. Open in 1999 when Bill Clinton was president. And in the last months of the Trump presidency, we were talking about her as a favorite, and she got to the semifinals. I mean, Serena is she's won more majors than anyone except for Margaret Court, which we don't really count. She's won doubles, but the longevity on Serena is just, this is 20 plus years at the top, which is just amazing.
And that seems to be the real differentiator, as you were saying earlier, in eras. I mean, we made a huge, and deservedly so, right? Because he was out of tennis the year before, but Jimmy Connor's run, which is a great 30 for 30, if you've never seen it, a wonderful documentary on his run in 1991, in which Jon Wertheim plays a part in the documentary. But a phenomenal run, and it was everything that Connors wanted about sports. He won probably the greatest point in tennis history against Paul Harhus, and eventually was defeated by Jim Courier. But you mentioned Federer, 39 or whatever. If he doesn't make the semifinals of majors, that's the story, not some miraculous run. It's seen as what's wrong with Roger Federer.
That's a great way to put it. That's great. Yeah.
We've reached the point of the Leaders and Legends podcast where every guest gets asked the same 5 questions. We're on with Jon Wertheim, executive editor of Sports Illustrated. Jon, are you ready?
Sure. I don't know what I'm jumping into, but yeah.
What was your first job?
Oh, man. My first summer job was scraping poison ivy off of dormitories on the IU campus. My first non-outdoor job, non-dermatologically risky job was I worked for the Portland Trailblazers fan magazine, Rip City, right out of college for $11 an hour, and one of the great years of my life.
They were pretty damn good at that time.
Yeah, they were damn good. Exactly. That's right.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
Oh, man. I think before I saw Mellencamp, I saw Billy Idol and the Colt at Market Square Arena on festival tickets, and nearly risked my life doing so.
We do like Billy Idol here on the Leaders and Legends podcast. That's a great concert. And number 3, if you could recommend any book for someone to read, which book would you suggest?
Oh, man. Any book. Give me more. Sports fans, just anything?
Anything. If you want to recommend Strokes of Genius, Federer, Nadal, and the Greatest Match Ever Played, which was written by Jon Wertheim, then go right ahead.
Oh, man, I would never be so. That wouldn't be very Indiana to plug my own work. I would say anything by John McPhee, who's written about everything from tennis to the principal of his high school to truck driving, who is just a really elegant writer who reports so deeply. You feel like you're an expert on the topic when you get to the end of the book. John McPhee is a great American treasure. Did
you read Season on the Brink when it came out?
Oh, yeah. No, it's funny. I actually was talking to, yeah, I did. I was, I mean, again, I think John Fine, we joke about this. He has no recollection of it. I think he drove me home from middle school once because Pat Knight and I lived near each other, and something happened with the coach Knight, and John Feinstein came and got us as a favor to coach. But I mean, I knew he was in town reporting, and then as soon as that book came out and was available, I ran and read it cover to cover. Sure.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh man. I think I would say that maybe the 27 Yankees, just because there was so from Lindbergh to the looming depression, just there was so much else going on at the same time. But I'd say the 1927 New York Yankees.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
Oh, man. That's a great question that I should have a better prepared answer for.
You've had dinner with a bunch of amazing people.
I mean, truth here. I mean, I would love to talk to, I'm tempted to say Donald Trump, just to get a sense of how much of this is, I still have not resolved myself to how much of this is calculated and how much of this he genuinely believes. I mean, is this sort of genius or evil genius? How much he really believes and how much of this is just leftover reality TV strategy? I would say I'd put John Roberts pretty high up there as well, our Chief Supreme Court Justice. And then just for kicks, maybe Axl Rose.
Think there's more in common between Donald Trump and Axl Rose than between John Roberts and Donald Trump?
The old John Roberts, Axl Rose, it's there are pros and cons for each.
You have been listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast, presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel, Grand Hall, and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been Jon Wertheim, executive editor of Sports Illustrated and a Hoosier born and bred. Jon, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It was a real treat.
Oh, likewise. That was good fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.